Okay, thank you very much, everyone. And it's really good to see so many people in the room. This is a bit of a first for us because, well, first of all, it's the first face-to-face meeting we've had since the pandemic, so probably 3 years, I think, partly because of the pandemic, but partly because we discovered that Zoom meant that we could get much wider audiences, people from the States and across Europe and so on. So that's been a new feature of our events. This one is also a first because it's the first one we're doing as a hybrid. Ibrahim is the technical expert. Thank you so much, Ibrahim, for setting all this up. So we're both in person here and we're online. And there's a whole number of people out there listening to this event as well. So when we come at the end to Q&As, I'll try and choose between questions in the room and questions that will come through the chat box. So those out there online, please put your questions to the chat. So let me introduce Nawal. I don't think she needs much introduction, but Nawal Al-Maghafi, a Yemeni from, am I allowed to say from the north or originally from Sana'a, because you're going to be talking a bit about that, has been for over 10 years a special correspondent at the BBC. She's becoming very famous these days, so we're a bit in awe of Nawal. And only yesterday, she flew back from New York to receive an Emmy for her film on COVID in Yemen, which she's just given me the date, which was August 2020, but she's just received the Emmy. This means she's terribly jet lagged. Thank you so much for sticking to the agenda when we set this. We didn't know this was going to happen, but she insisted that she would come. Thank you so much for staying with us. So I think I'm not going to introduce Nawal anymore. I think we're more interested in what she's got to hear. She's got a lot to say about Yemen, obviously as a Yemeni, but also she's had the chance, which most Yemenis who leave the country don't have, which is of going back to the country. And she's been there recently, so she'll talk a bit about that. She's also going to talk a bit about her own childhood experiences of education in Yemen and how that has deteriorated so badly since the war. So I think over to you, Nawal. We're going to, she can talk for however long she wants, but I think it's going to be 20-25 minutes. And then we'll open up to Q&A. And then right at the end, we're going to have a very brief comment from one of the projects that BYS supports, because any money that we make from this evening's event, we will put towards that. But that will come a bit later. Nawal, over to you.
Thank you so much. First of all, I want to say it's a pleasure to be here. It's always nice to be surrounded by people who love and are as fond of Yemen as I am. So it's always a pleasure to come and speak for the British-Yemeni Society. Thank you all for coming. I actually wanted to start by telling you a bit about myself and not introduce my work or what I do, but a bit about my background. I was in New York, and when I was speaking to people in the audience after the award ceremony, I realized that a lot of the people that were there thought that I was born and bred in the UK, that I say I'm Yemeni for show, and that I was raised in the UK, educated in the UK, and that's why I'm doing so well. And I had to correct them over and over again and say, no, actually, I was born and bred in Yemen. I became British in my 20s. I was educated in Yemen. I went to school in Yemen. I spent many summers as well in my grandparents' house. I traveled around Yemen as a child. I went to Hodeidah for my summers on the beach. We went to Aden for Eid, and that's where I spent my childhood. That's how I remember Yemen. I came here when I was a teenager for a few years, and then back again when I came for university. And as soon as I finished university, I went back to Yemen. So I really owe a lot of my success to Yemen and to my teachers in Yemen who educated me. Of course, I came to university here, but I owe Yemen for everything that I've been able to achieve. And it was incredible to be able to win an award for a film that I made on Yemen. And I was incredibly proud, but I was more proud of the contributors that were in that film. The film was about COVID, and the doctors who were working on the front line of COVID are the most inspirational people I've ever met in my life. Working under those circumstances in a country that was facing the world's worst humanitarian crisis, without any resources, without any salaries, putting themselves on the front line of those hospitals, and in a place where the authorities are denying COVID even exists, where wearing PPE is a criminality in itself. It was the most harrowing, but the most eye-opening and inspirational experience of my life going back there. Before I went back there, I was working for Newsnight at the BBC, and I was working in NHS hospitals. And, what the doctors were doing here was incredible. But if you can imagine that fear that we were feeling here in the UK when faced with COVID, what was it like for people in Yemen? They didn't have time to fear it because there was so much more going on. Why fear something that you can't do anything about anyway, that you're not going to get any support to fight? But anyway, that wasn't part of my talk. I just wanted to start with that introduction. So yeah. Today I was thinking about what to speak about, and I really wanted to come here, not as a BBC journalist, but as me, Nawal the Yemeni, and to tell you about my personal experience working on some of the pieces that I've worked on and what it's been like for me, just witnessing some of the harrowing things that I've witnessed in Yemen. So I'm going to start with talking about the first day I went to Yemen after the war. It was Sunday, the 30th of August in 2015, and it was the first commercial flight to land in Sana'a when I returned to Yemen for the first time after the war broke out. It was quite early in my career at the BBC. I was still a producer back then. And I remember that flight because the image of that airplane is stuck in my mind. The airplane was incredibly old, and the overhead baggage compartments, the baggage was falling out as we were taking off. They were packed, they were broken. The air hostess had taped them with black tape before we left. And I noticed that as she was giving her safety, the safety announcement that they give you in the beginning of the flight about where to find your oxygen masks, I remember looking for the oxygen masks and realized that where they're meant to be was actually empty and hollowed out. There were no oxygen masks. And when the flight attendant saw me searching for the oxygen mask, she said, the new Yemeni airplanes were in Sana'a airport when the war began and they've been bombed. And so that's why we're having to fly into Sana'a on this plane, which was a very, very old plane. I was traveling with the BBC veteran war correspondent, Gabriel Gatehouse, and he'd spent years reporting on conflict zones. And this was just another conflict zone for him, another job. And I remember he asked me on that plane, he said, by the way, have you ever gone to a war zone? And, it hadn't hit me where we were headed, because in my mind, I felt like I was going back to Sana'a, the place where I grew up as a child. I was going back home. And I didn't realize that I was actually on my first assignment as a war correspondent. And that was my first assignment as a war correspondent. And for anyone who knows me really well, I'm a complete wuss. I don't know how I became a war correspondent, but that was my first time. And ever since, I've taken everything that I've learned in Yemen with me, wherever I've been, to Iraq, Syria, wherever I've gone. It's what I learned in Yemen that I take with me. So nothing can prepare you emotionally for landing in the place that you call home, to find it torn apart by war. I'll never forget that flight into Sana'a, because as we were approaching, as the flight was landing, I could see that entire neighborhoods had been completely leveled. As we got closer to the airport, I could see that the airport had been bombed extensively, that the runways had, big craters in them. They were destroyed. And on the drive to the Taj Sheba Hotel, where we were staying in central Sana'a, I realized that in the few months that I'd been away, I left 6 months earlier, the city had taken on the characteristics of Sada, because I'd visited Sada after 6 years of war during the Arab Spring. And it was the first time I go to a place that was haunted by war. And when I went into Sada, Sana'a, that's what it reminded me of. Sana'a was now essentially a city on siege. And it wasn't only the destruction that took me by surprise, but this was a whole new Yemen. This change was reinforced by a new regime, the Houthis. And on past trips, this wasn't the first time I come to Yemen as a journalist, but it was the first time that I had to work with the Houthis. On past trips before this one, I would go to the Ministry of Information to get my permissions to work, and I would be told that I had to take a minder with me, and I'd say, I really don't want to take the minder. And they'd say, fine, pay him for his get and he can stay at home. And that's what I always did. I never had a minder before this. But on this trip, as soon as we got to the Taj Sheba Hotel, we were met by a Houthi minder. And they made very clear that there was a new authority in town. And we were told that this minder had to be with us every step of the way. And I can tell you, when I said, can I pay him for his gad and can he stay at home? No one was laughing. We were now at risk of going to prison if we broke the rules of what we could report. And this tension, this difficulty to report in Yemen has only gotten worse over the years since the war began. Just to give you an idea, on my last trip when I was making the film on COVID in Yemen, I had 6 Houthi minders with me wherever I went as I was filming, watching everything I was doing. Now, that trip was so early on in the war. I still had a lot of hope, you know. The more we traveled around, yes, a lot of buildings had been destroyed. We had lost family members. I'd met many families who had lost loved ones in the attacks, in the airstrikes or Houthi shelling. But I still had hope that there was an opportunity, you know, that Yemen could still be the Yemen I once knew when I was a child. It felt like we could still come back from this. You know, the buildings could be rebuilt and what was broken could be fixed. But over the years, that feeling has really changed. I later went to Yemen. After this trip, I came back to the UK and we put out some pieces. And then I went back to Yemen in 2016. And I'd go to Yemen because the UN had started to announce that a humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen was imminent. At the time, I know now it's commonplace, but we hadn't seen those pictures of starving children on our screens, or this was all hearsay. And I remember when we went to Yemen in 2016, we went to Sana'a, we went to multiple hospitals trying to find children with severe malnutrition like the UN was warning, and we couldn't find any. So I wanted to get to the heart of where the supply shortage was. So I decided to travel to Hodeidah, where Yemen's imports enter the country. Most of Yemen's imports enter from there. I stayed with a doctor called Ashwag Muharram, and she was an incredible force of nature. She ran a mobile clinic providing medical care, food and medicine to those who are most in need. And in a place like Yemen where women are rarely seen, Ashwag was unmistakable. She was a hero when she went into these villages, formidable and just a great force in her black abaya and colorful headscarves. And she drove me around in her SUV for a couple of weeks. I stayed with her at home. And she was my guide through this dark, corrupt, and rarely reported underside of Yemen's civil war. You know, the black markets, the fuel black markets at the time, the understaffed and overflowing hospitals, the undocumented civilian casualties of women and children. She took me to the Hodeidah port where bombed cranes were, you know, listed dangerously over water, and explained to me how corruption and coalition security checks, where the port manager actually, not her, the port manager explained to me how corruption and coalition security checks were the reason dozens of ships sat there for months, unable to offload fuel and supplies. Then she took me to the villages. And in the villages, unlike in Sana'a, you know, the hospital, we didn't meet any children severely malnourished in hospitals, but when she took me to the villages in 2016, I met mothers with children who became the faces of a worldwide campaign to stop hunger in Yemen. And you're going to meet them in a second. Children like Salim, an 8-year-old who looked as if and weighed as if he was a 2-year-old. I met Abdulrahman, who's 18-month-old, was lactose intolerant and was starving to death because the formula her baby needed wasn't available anywhere. And even when we tried to help her, it took us weeks before we were able to ship in this formula from abroad. And you won't see this in the piece, but I'll never forget that we spent weeks trying to get her son formula because he would have died without it. And when we brought it into her home, we asked her to bring a baby bottle. And she spent a couple of minutes looking for a baby bottle, and she brought us this plastic baby bottle that looked like it had been with them for years. It was full of mud, it was incredibly dirty. And then Dr. Ashwag told her not to feed her son with that bottle, that she'd bring her bottles. You know, people who are in desperate need for the most basic things we take for granted. I met Fatima, the 6-month-old girl who was frail and tiny and who never stopped crying. And her mother, Fatima, was so severely malnourished that she couldn't produce milk herself to feed her daughter. I also met Dr. Abdullah Zuhairi at Hodeidah General Hospital, who didn't have insulin, Pediasure, albumin for burn victims, and he still treated 1,200 patients a day, like 3-year-old Shahid, who you'll also see in the piece that we're about to show now. So we'll show this piece and then I'll continue my talk. It's been a while since I watched that piece, and it's a very difficult watch. But this was in 2016. You know, some of the numbers that I said back then have inflated incredibly. The situation has gotten a lot worse for children. I mean, I said earlier when I was making that report, I still thought there was hope that we could get back from this. But every year that this war goes on, that hope diminishes. It's really hard for me to see the impact that this war is having on children. Soon, this was in Hodeidah, and I think everyone always asks me, how do you do it? How can you report on stuff like this and meet mothers like this and children like this and continue? And honestly, you kind of remain guarded and you try and keep a distance and have some sort of guard up so you can continue doing this job. You know, of course, I sympathize and I connect with our contributors and it's heartbreaking, but I try and keep a distance so I can keep doing it. And when it was in Hodeidah, maybe it was easier. When I've reported from anywhere in the world, it's been completely different to me than when I've reported on Yemen, because it's just so much closer to home. And even in Yemen, I felt like when we were witnessing these things in Hodeidah, I was still able to keep a bit of a distance because it's not the place where I grew up in. But it wasn't long before cases like this were reaching the capital. You know, this was no longer the poor becoming poorer. Middle-class families were starting to be affected by this too. So where was I? I drifted off there. So everyone else, I try and keep a distance. And I've always managed to keep that distance until one day I was in the Sab'in hospital in Sana'a, which is only a few minutes from my home. And I was in the main children's ward, and we were doing a report on malnutrition reaching the capital. And I bumped into this woman I knew in the hallway of this hospital as we were waiting for the doctor to show us around. And she's a family friend, someone I'd seen in weddings and gatherings. And it was a complete surprise. And I had no idea why she was there. So I went up to her and I said, you know, what are you doing here? Are you a doctor or are you a nurse? She's a family friend, so I never knew, you know, what she did for a living. I just knew that she worked. And her face dropped. She was so embarrassed to see me. This was in 2018, 2 years after this report. And she just wanted to get away. So she said, you know, I have to go, you know, good to see you. And she rushed off. And I couldn't think of any other reason in that moment as to why she would be in that ward, because it was the ward that was taking care of children with severe acute malnutrition, which is a really serious form of malnutrition. Malnutrition like you saw in that report. So she clearly wasn't comfortable. She rushed off. And then later in that day, the doctor that came to show us around that ward, who was working with these children, came to show us around, and he told me how one of the difficulties they're facing is that Yemenis are really proud. And so they're only bringing their children into the hospitals when it's almost too late, when the situation is really bad, because they're embarrassed. They're embarrassed that they can't feed their children. So they try and keep it hidden away in their homes. And he told me, let me take you to see this one patient. His family are middle class and he might not make it. And so we walked into the ward, and there she was, this family friend of mine, holding her son on her lap. And her son was so severely malnourished, he was gasping for air. He was wearing his t-shirt, but I could see his ribcage going up and down. And she just looked at me and she wept. She had no words. She was just so incredibly embarrassed that it was almost like I'd caught her. And I had no words either. I didn't let our cameraman into the room. I just sat there and I wept with her. And I just didn't know what to say. But it hit me then. And, and very rarely do I lose my composure. But this was one of those moments that I just didn't know what to do. I was no longer Nawal the journalist. This was our family friend, and she was suffering. And it really hit me that the impact of this war was hitting every single home in Yemen, but people are too embarrassed to share it. And what we're seeing here is just, there's so much more that is going on in people's homes, people suffering silently, that are too embarrassed to speak out. And then I tried to find out who she was, and I realized that I knew her because my auntie was the head teacher of a school, and she was one of the teachers, and her husband was a teacher too. And teachers have been without a salary for years now. Yemen's teachers are largely unpaid. Sometimes they get stipends from NGOs, but they're forced to leave their jobs because they can't afford it, or forced to take second jobs or move to other employment. I mean, as it stands now, UNICEF needs $70 million to pay the stipends to 160,000 teachers and school-based staff. And that's less than half the total amount of teachers that there are in public schools in Yemen. So that just gives you an idea of the state of schools in Yemen. I usually hate talking about statistics because I think when we kind of make it about statistics, people forget that these are humans behind the numbers. But I feel like I've spoken to you about specific people that I've met, and you've seen the report. But I want to remind everyone the scale of the problem, because the numbers that you saw in the report are from 2016, and the situation now is a whole lot worse. 80% of the population, that's 24 million people, are in desperate need of humanitarian aid. The economic activity is down by 50%, and the poverty rate is up to 80%, and the middle class is eroding. So that's 10% of the population reliant on remittances are seeing declines of up to 80%. There are 3.6, I said in that report that there were 1 million internally displaced people. That number now stands at 3.6 million internally displaced people in the country, with around 155,000 added in the last year because of recent fighting in Marib and in Hodeida. The UN says that if the war doesn't end by the end of the year, development in Yemen will have gone back by 25 years. And if it ends in 2030, development in Yemen would be set back 40 years. So that gives you an idea of how important it is for us to push for this war to end. And there's no time to waste. Yemen's children, especially the 2 million who are IDPs, are the most vulnerable. UNICEF says that 12 million need urgent aid to survive. By the end of this year, the number of malnourished children under age 5 would reach 2.4 million. So can you imagine? We said 370,000 in that report in 2016. Now it's 2.4 million children under the age of 5 that need humanitarian assistance. 8 million children are out of school. Many children are staying out of school because of negative coping mechanisms like child labor, child marriages, child soldiers, or other forms of exploitation. And other children are kept at home because they're afraid of infection of disease and their parents can't afford medical care, so they keep them at home. Or they can't afford the cost of schooling. And so really the summation of that is we are at risk of losing an entire generation of Yemenis. Entire generation of Yemenis who are our only hope of a better future for the country. I just came back from Yemen last month, and it was incredible to land in Sana'a airport for the first time in 7 years, which was great. But Sana'a looked different all over again. You know, although it was incredible to land in Sana'a airport and to be there during a ceasefire, so to be able to go out and about with no fighting, I really realized how it isn't the Sana'a that I grew up in anymore. Every day, I would see children and elderly people lining up outside our homes with pots to take water from tankers that had been donated by some doers of good. Sometimes those tanks are empty, and so they can't have any clean water for that day. And you see poverty wherever you turn, whether it's going to family gatherings, and you can see that some people are suffering silently, or you meet friends or family members who have lost their jobs and have lost their entire livelihoods. People who are now relocated to miserable IDP camps because they've lost their homes and have been left there abandoned and forgotten. And amid this complete misery, this time, instead of seeing destruction and flattened out neighborhoods, what I saw was a different world had emerged, one of beautiful new villas in the central city of Sana'a. Lavish high-rise buildings, magnificent malls, new petrol stations, currency exchange, private schools, hospitals, all financed by the stolen national revenue. Yemen is now the world of the extremely poor that can't feed their children, but also the extremely rich that have been made richer by this war. And you know, that was something that I found very shocking and very difficult to digest. We're waiting now to hear if this ceasefire will be extended. I can't stress enough how important it is for us to continue with that messaging, that this ceasefire must continue and some solution to this war, regardless of how many people are profiteering from it, must happen. This war must come to an end, or Yemen will lose an entire generation. So yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that.
Well, thank you so much, Nawal. My goodness, you've got such an extraordinary experience, and so good to have somebody who's actually been to Yemen and seen what it's like. I did manage to get there myself just briefly to Sana'a last year, and I can see what you're saying about the inequalities that are developing. So now let's open this up to questions. I think particularly on the theme of the long-term impact of the war on children. While I can see we've got other questions here on the Q&A. Let me just see if we've got questions waiting. Looks like they are coming through now. Is that correct?
Yeah,
yes. Okay. Sure, yeah. Okay. Well, look, I'm just going to ask one while people are thinking about questions, and we've got a microphone we can pass around the room. But my question was this: so there's now been 2 extensions to the truce, so it's basically 6 months of peace we're looking at now, and there's talk of a possible 6-month extension to the truce, so that would again give some confidence to people. But my question is this: what would it take, in your view, having met the IDPs, to have enough confidence to go back? Is a 6-month truce enough, or does there need to be a much more permanent, peaceful solution before those IDPs will go back home?
That's a really difficult question. But what I would say is one of the problems I think right now is that people are relying on emergency aid to survive. And so it's one thing for your neighborhood to be safe, but then number 2, you have your home rebuilt and your farmland restored, the farmland that you were reliant on to survive and for your family to survive. So I don't think it's only about security, it's also about development and about taking people from relying on emergency aid and helping them with development so that they can rely on themselves. And I think we've got a long way to go. I mean, for a lot of these questions, my answer is going to be the war has to stop first. There is so much that needs to be done, but without the war stopping, there's a standstill. You can't work on development when you are risking that it might be destroyed a few weeks later. NGOs can't afford to invest on development until the war ends. And you've now created a system where people are completely reliant on emergency aid. They don't know how to fend for themselves. And I think that is the problem.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So let me just take a show of hands. How many questions do we have in the room? Because there are some coming in online. Okay, one there. Okay, we've got a couple of questions. Let me just take this one first because it's been up there from Fatima Johnson. You can see it yourself, Nawal. What can the Yemen diaspora do to help Yemeni children in practice? She's volunteered in a refugee camp in Lebanon and wants to do something more. She's basically by culture and ethnicity from Aden Tyres, but born in UK. Is there any discrimination, though, against someone who affiliates with the South Yemen? Successfully, you saw that bit as well. Okay, there you go.
Yeah, so what can I do as someone from the, is that up there? No, from the Yemeni diaspora to help? I mean, what I would say is that there are some incredible Yemeni charities working on the ground in Yemen. I've followed some of their work and filmed some of their work. Charities, I don't want to name them because I feel like I won't do it justice. I'll probably say some and forget the others. So I'm happy to respond to anyone directly with names. But there are some brilliant Yemeni charities on the ground doing amazing work. They are also doing work here in the UK. So there are charities that are raising money here in the UK and then setting up programs to help families in Yemen. One that comes to mind in the UK is, I think, Mona Relief. And there are others, some in New York as well. I know that there's 2 or 3 charities in New York that have set up base there, raising money there, but setting up incredible programs in Yemen. And they're all set up by Yemenis who know Yemen very well. I mean, of course, you can also go down the NGO route, but I feel like it's, you know, the Yemeni charities that are working in Yemen are doing a great job.
Fantastic, thank you. Right, well, I saw a couple of hands. Do you want to ask a question? Is there a roving microphone? Do you want to take the microphone, or can they just, if not, just speak loudly? Over to you.
I'd like your opinion on the new presidential council, which has quite a lot of representatives from all the various factions, apart from the Houthis. Do you think they can realistically do something to change the situation, the political situation, and the humanitarian situation? Could you repeat the question?
So yeah, so what do I think about the new presidential council? So, you know, I try not to give my opinion too much, but what I can say is that I am cautiously optimistic. A change had to happen. You know, we weren't making any progress with President Hadi remaining in his position. Something had to change. I don't think I can say, you know, this change is for the better or not for the better until we see them come to some sort of agreement where this war ends. And what we have seen since they've come into power in the last couple of months is that the ceasefire to a certain extent has been able to hold. And this is one of the longest ceasefires that we've had since the war began. And I think we all have to champion that and see that as some sort of positive progress. But I remain cautiously optimistic as to whether they will find a lasting solution. But yeah, I think it's definitely changed for the better. I have to also be wary that I have my BBC hat on too. But yeah, next question.
We realise you have to be a bit discreet what you say. Thank you. But it's a very good question. Now there was another question over there. Yes, go ahead. But just speak up so we can hear you, and the whole room can hear you.
This is about the education. I just wanted to know, in the Houthi-controlled areas, what middle education and what people can go to school. But I'm assuming that the Houthis have a very, very controlled system of education.
Yeah.
And watching very carefully on what is taught.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very depressing. I mean, there's multiple things that I saw on this last trip because I specifically went to visit schools. Number one, they forced everyone. So there's multiple international schools in Sana'a, one of which I went to school in. You know, we have the American school, the British school, Yemen modern school, etc. The Houthis have imposed on all the public schools, number one, that they have to be segregated. They can't have mixed classrooms. Number two, they can't have names like the American school or the Turkish school or the British school. They now have schools that have to be signed off by the Houthis. Their curriculums are being overseen. The Houthis now implement an assembly in the beginning of the day, which usually will have the Houthi logo. They, you know, force the children to give speeches, and It's really shocking what goes on. And then the Arabic curriculum that is published by the Ministry of Information, not information, the Ministry of Education, excuse me. The Ministry of Education, they have changed that too. And I haven't gone into detail. It's something I'm working on, and I want to write something properly on it. But just flicking through the pages, some of the things I saw in those books were shocking. You know, looking at, I remember looking at the maths book for children of year 4, basically year 4. I don't know how old they are, like 10 years old. And it will say something like, you know, 5 of your friends went to battle, 4 of them were martyred, how many are left? So that's how they're teaching kids math. Just really, really shocking that this was the new education syllabus for Northern Yemen. As well as that, in public schools, we spoke about teachers not being given salaries, but they're still being forced to go to work, and it's by force. Not only that, everything they're teaching is being overseen, and again, they're having to teach this new curriculum that I just spoke about. But there's a lot of change happening, and it's really devastating to see. But children, those who are able to make it into the classroom, and not many are being able to make it. You know, we just said 8 million children are out of school right now. So those who are able to make it into the classroom are not getting the education that I got. They're getting, you know, it's devastating to see.
Could I just ask you as well, how do you feel about the fact that the BBC Arabic service is being closed down?
It's no, honestly, I'm really, really heartbroken. Not only is it heartbreaking because 380 of my colleagues are going to be let go, but we grew up listening to BBC Arabic radio. That's why I'm able to master the Arabic language at work as well as I can, because I've listened to BBC Arabic radio day in, day out. And no, I'm really upset. But, you know, when funding gets cut by the government, that's what happens. Difficult decisions have to be made.
Could I follow that up with another question on international media coverage? You may not be able to answer it, but because of your particular position, but it seems to me while there's been absolutely outstanding reportage out of Yemen, particularly by women journalists, it's sporadic. And therefore Yemen dips in and out of the news in a way that, for example, Ukraine does not. And that it means that the pressure on the international community that you would find helpful in stopping the war is not really sustained. It's not in the international community's mind. Yes, if you're a supporter of UNICEF, yes, Oxfam, whatever, but and not beyond that, not in a powerful political way. So I wonder if you could say something about what you feel, not as a BBC reporter, but as a Yemeni who can see the problems with reporting, the access problems, the money that's required. But surely we are entitled to a more sustained, in-depth coverage of Yemen than we are getting.
Access is almost impossible. The Yemeni government will not allow foreign journalists into Yemen. They very, very rarely give them visas. And when they do, we go in. You know, I mean, just to, not to make this personal, but I was on maternity leave for a year and a half. And for a year, sorry. And my colleagues applied for visas and not one of them was able to get a visa. And so for a whole year, the BBC did one report on Yemen because the government allowed Jeremy Bowen to go with them to Marib. And that was it. And I'm able to get in because I have a Yemeni passport, so I don't need the Yemeni government to give me a visa. I go in and I hire local Yemenis. You know, the COVID film was done by a completely Yemeni crew, Yemeni cameraman, Yemeni producers, because I can't take anyone in because the Yemeni government won't give us visas. And just to point out, because I'm hoping there are people from the embassy here, I'm not sure there are, but I applied for a film crew to come with me to that COVID film. And I was in touch with the Yemen Minister of Information, and I spoke to them on repeat for months to give my crew visas. and they didn't refuse them, but they refused to give them. They wouldn't give an answer. And they thought we wouldn't make that film, but instead I went in and I hired an all Yemeni crew and I taught them the craft in order for us to be able to make that film. So it's because they are systematically not allowing us in. And it's sad because the film was about how the Houthis were covering up COVID. You know, that's what we also showed how the government failed to react to COVID in the south and how all the hospitals shut down and there were no doctors and stuff. But then we went to the north. It was a very balanced film and looked into how the Houthis tried to cover it up and were also failing the people. And so when you don't allow journalists in, when the government doesn't allow journalists in to cover the situation, they're also not covering the Houthi atrocities. We're not out to just get the government, you know, that's not what we do for a living. We're out to uncover what is happening in the country. And so so that means even the Houthis are getting away with atrocities that we're unable to cover. And it's incredibly difficult because then I feel, I mean, I'm not meant to be just doing Yemen. I'm a Middle East correspondent, but I find myself only reporting on Yemen because if I don't, with my Yemeni passport, no one else will. And so, yeah, it's access that is the main issue. I know we have two crews right now that had their visa requests with the embassy for a couple of months now, and we're still waiting for them to be processed.
Is it not right to say that the permission and access problem is at local level as well? So you can get a visa, lets you into the country, but then you can't get to the bit of the country you particularly want to go to because the local governor won't.
So like the Houthis, for example, I mean, you know, I can't say that it's just the government. You'll get into Yemen and the Houthis will make your life hell when you're reporting, but they'll still let you do it. You know, I had minders watching me when I was making the film on COVID. It was incredibly damning of the Houthis and the way they work in Yemen. Yes, it was difficult to film those things with them watching over me, but the editing and the reporting all happens here in the UK, and we're able to do, you know, so once you're in, you're able to work with what you've got.
But
you need
even
to
in
get
the government-controlled areas where you've got the visa to be in the country, but the local governor
he'll be watching. It's the same thing.
Won't let you necessarily go to where you need to get to.
That's true, but we're able to work around that. I think once you have access, that's why I was using the Houthi-held territories as an example, because they too will be watching you and want to escort you to places and stuff. But I feel like if you've done the background, you've really spoken to people from before you even got into the country, and you know what the situation is like, and you're not taking everything at face value as to what they want to show you, you'll be able to come out with a really good report, regardless of the complications you face on the ground. We face those complications everywhere. Journalists are unwanted in any country in the Middle East. We face them in Syria and Iraq, and we've learned how to work around them. And we can do that in Yemen too, but with Yemen, they've just completely blocked us from getting in. And it's very problematic.
Well, thank goodness the BBC has you, and there is this commitment, this personal commitment you have to reporting from Yemen. We're running a little bit out of time, but are there any other questions from the floor? We can take one or two.
I'll also be around afterwards.
Yeah, so we can talk to Nawal afterwards. Because we do have our cultural event starting soon. Yes, anyway, please ask your question. But just speak up loud so we can all hear you.
Yeah, of course.
Shukran.
I just wanted to touch on education again. I know you didn't really talk about higher education, but I was made aware of a campaign, I think it was last year, about a number of international students who were supposed to be on scholarship, and then their sort of money stopped coming through. They were stuck abroad. There was like a campaign to sort of raise money, get them home, etc. I've not actually heard if anything developed from that, but I was wondering if you knew anything about that, or if that was something you might be looking into.
I had no idea, but that really doesn't surprise me. I mean, if there are government employees who work abroad who have their salaries stopped randomly and aren't getting paid, it doesn't surprise me that students on government scholarships as well don't get paid either. But I had no idea. That's really depressing. Sorry, I don't have anything to add to that.
Let me ask a last question, just to take it back to the education theme. You've made the point, Nawal, that it's very difficult to do anything until there's a more permanent peace. But given that so many, and I think particularly girls, are out of education for so many years, once there is peace, do you feel there's some sort of special catch-up process that needs to be put in place? Have you thought about how that might work after peace? Looking
I
ahead.
do think, that's why I say every year that this war goes on, the harder it will be for us to recover from it, because every year this war goes on is another year when these children aren't going to school, or it becomes more difficult for us to come back from this. But saying that, another point that I think is really important to make is that Yemen does have a lot of aid agencies that are working there that have a lot of money. I know we continuously say they're underfunded, they're not receiving, but there is a lot of money going into the operation in Yemen. And once this war ends again, that the NGO focus will move from just emergency aid and keeping people alive to working on development projects to get students back into school, to get these young girls rehabilitated, to, that's where the focus will shift. And so that's why it has to start with, because that money is going to continue coming in. If anything, it's more likely that Yemen will get more funding if it's for development rather than emergency aid. And so it's just the focus needs to shift, and that's not going to happen until this war ends.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, look, this is absolutely fascinating talk and a very sort of dramatic reminder of what the conditions are like in Yemen at the moment. And thank you so much for rushing back from New York from your award to join us. And we can talk to Nawal afterwards. Now, I just wanted to introduce quickly Victoria Burch, who's going to talk to us very briefly, a couple of minutes, 2 to 3 minutes, about Action for Child Trauma. This is a project that BYS has been supporting over just, I think, the last 18 months, 2 years. They've started operations, I think, in Taiz, Hadramaut, and Aden. And this is, another dimension of what Nawal's been talking about, the trauma that is experienced by so many of these children. So, Victoria, I'm dying to hear what you have to say. Please, please. And by the way, any funds that people are able to give tonight as a dedicated contribution, or any profit we make from the culture event, will go to ACT. So please dip into your pockets upstairs if you're able to. Sorry.
Thank you very much for inviting us tonight. I'm Victoria Burch. I'm a child psychologist and clinical lead and trustee for Action for Child Trauma International. We've heard so and seen so powerfully from Nawal's talk and documentary of the scale of devastating suffering experienced by people in Yemen, and particularly by the children. Now, alongside the physical suffering that we've seen all too clearly, war brings immense mental suffering. It goes without saying. And children who don't understand what is happening and have not got the life experience to see what life might be like in the future, that peace might be possible and that development might be possible again, can become so affected by high levels of anxiety, by tremendously high levels of psychological trauma, that it stops development. They're not able to concentrate, they're not able to learn. Now, in a few children, this is very sad for the children and their families. If you multiply that across a country, you have, as Nawal has said, a generation that can't contribute to the rebuilding of the country when peace arrives. At Action for Child Trauma International, we train local people to treat children with post-traumatic stress disorder and with disabling high levels of anxiety. We have trained people in 17 countries. We train now, we have a big focus of work in the Middle East, as you can imagine, where we have a large team working in Arabic. As well as providing training, mainly for teachers, although we also train mental health personnel where they are available, but most of the post-conflict and post-disaster settings where we work, there are no psychologists, or there aren't enough. So we're mainly working with teachers, social workers, childcare workers, whoever is interested in working with local children, we will train. As well as providing training, and as you can imagine, because of the areas we train in, much of our training now is online. We provide support and supervision for the people who we've trained, who often have very little mental health understanding before they do our very, very specialist courses. We have run, with support of you all, thank you very much indeed, 2 courses in Yemen. We've trained 43 volunteer teachers in Arabic online. The courses have been really well accepted. We have people in Yemen at the moment working with children in their schools and in children's health clinics, those kind of settings, to teach children how to cope with the disabling levels of anxiety that they're experiencing. And I think it's really important to emphasize, we're not talking just about how to cope with anxiety. Our course, which has been developed for children in post-conflict settings specifically, is called Anxiety and Resilience. And we are helping children to cope with anxiety, but then to learn how to be more resilient for the future, how to cope with all the problems that they are going to face as they move forward a little bit better, and how to hope that the future might be better. So we're giving children skills which will contribute towards the development of a better peace, a better future for Yemen when there is peace. So as I've said, we've trained 43 teachers to date. We are currently planning a 3rd course. That was delayed because of the renewed fighting, but we're very hopeful that this course, again online, where we'll be training 30 teachers in the north of the country, can happen before the end of this year. This course is not fully funded, which is one of the reasons I'm here, and we'd be very, very grateful for any contributions that anyone can make to this course. In the future, when we desperately hope that there will be peace, we will be able to do more training in Yemen. We'll be empowering local people to treat children with post-traumatic stress disorder, but that is work that needs to wait until there is peace. So we hope that our relationship with the people who we're working with in Yemen at the moment, not just online, will continue and will build in the future.
Thank you so much, Victoria. That's really, really helpful. This explaining this important work. Can you just clarify where are the centres at the moment? There's been 2 training courses, one in the north. Where are they? Where will they be?
We've trained in Taiz, in Hadramaut and Aden. The next course is in Sana'a and yes, that's right. Yes, and as you can imagine, those have been complicated to arrange, but we are making progress.
Well, thank you for persevering. So thank you so much for that. And I think it's now time to start the cultural event. I just want to say that Ibrahim, who has been shuttling backwards and forwards, who helps with all the technology, and Taha, who's over there, our vice chairman of the society, have been, and Hamdan, who have been, a number of people have been central to organising this. There's all sorts of things happening upstairs, including Yemen food and poetry. So please go and enjoy that. And thank you all so much for coming. Thank you.